One of the stories that certainly got our interest this week and has been much spoken about on the show and in various sources over the week has been the story about Chris Froome and the presence of salbutamol in a urine test arising from the Vuelta a España. It was a test that was confirmed on September the 7th. Froome found out, it seems, on September the 20th. And it was because of the journalism of The Guardian and of Le Monde that the news has now been made public. And one of the journalists who's involved in it on The Guardian side is Sean Ingle, who joins us on the line now. Good morning, Sean.
Good morning.
Can you tell us, first of all, just exactly how the story came on your radar?
I can't really without breaking sort of confidentiality, but we were working on it for a good while because we had to not only sort of double source it, but we had to then try and pick up all the bits. And essentially what happened is we went to Sky the night before it was published, and they said to us, Chris Froome is travelling, he can't get back to you straight away, which wasn't correct, obviously. And there was various comings and goings, but eventually we published it very early along with Le Monde on Wednesday morning.
So you'd been in touch, they said he was travelling, which you're saying later materialised that it hadn't been. Would that leave any doubt in your minds about in terms of the publishing of it? Because I understand the legal wranglings that can happen obviously in the background over these things.
Well, yeah, I mean, so all these stories, the way British law works, you really have to kind of get the other side's view, and also you have to give them time to come up with a view. And normally what happens is you send a list of questions off and everything we knew about the story was right. The only thing we didn't know was whether Chris Froome had been present when they tested his B sample, so we asked that. And normally what happens is they then send you your answers back, you publish a piece, and then it's kind of almost good practice really to then spend a little bit of time, let the story be there, and then you would send a statement out to the rest of the media. What they did with us is they promised a statement, by 6:30. They said, wait a second. So we waited for them because we thought it would be polite. They sent us a statement a few minutes after that, and then almost immediately sent it to the world, the wider world, which perhaps they wanted to manage the PR. Of course they did, but ethically that isn't how it's normally done in this business. It's normally a kind of quid pro quo. We come to you, we give you time to give us your answers. You then give us time to put the story up. But hey, that's Sky for you.
They were trying to unscoop your scoop, is what you're saying.
Oh yeah, but that's how it sometimes is.
That's the way it works. Yeah. Look, just in terms of Chris Froome and his various utterances this week, he says that he's followed the protocol and that he'll be exonerated of any wrongdoing in the fullness of time here. What does an exoneration in the context of this story even look like?
Well, I mean, the thing is, and I've got a lot of abuse from Team Sky fans over the last few days, but basically, he has committed adverse analytical finding, and under the WADA code, he has to explain how this, elevated concentration of salbutamol is in his urine, and the burden of proof lies with him. So to be exonerated, he has to basically find a way of convincing the UCI and the World Anti-Doping Agency that this happened by chance. So almost certainly going to go down the dehydration route. They're going to say, because he was dehydrated, it led to these elevated levels. The problem with that defence is it wasn't particularly hot that day, wasn't a particularly long stage. He had the Team Sky car around him all the time. So what would have made him dehydrated is the obvious question. Now, perhaps there was impaired liver function, but that's quite a serious thing. And the next day he is, he's bombing away and taking time out of Vincenzo Nibali. So I think WADA would, if you come up with that explanation, WADA will want to probe deeper into that. So I think what you'll see happen probably over the next few weeks is that Froome's team will go to the UCI or WADA and say, look, we have lots of data, but we want more. And they will want his urine from throughout the Vuelta. And they will try and see whether there was, perhaps even when he was on normal doses of salbutamol, whether it was elevated levels than it should have been. And then he had a bit more and suddenly it spiked, or what. They're going to try and find something. So that's the first stage. If that doesn't work, I expect he'll probably have, a test where they put you in a laboratory and then they try and replicate what happened on September 7th. But how they can do that fairly, I don't know. I mean, you won't have 2 weeks of fatigue. You won't have all the other conditions. So that's where we are. But it's up to Froome to prove he can have an explanation for it. And if he doesn't, he will be stripped of the Vuelta, I'm sure, and possibly face a ban as well.
Yeah, I mean, that would be irreparable damage, and it's definitely virtually impossible, I think, as you say, to properly replicate the conditions that in terms of his body and everything else, the other factors, the variables at that time. The one, just last question on that point, Sean, that's kind of struck me over the last few days since the stories come out. It's 43 days since Froome would have known about this, and he's spoken himself about in the statement since about, you know, I would have known every morsel of food, I would have known every puff of the inhaler that I would have taken. Like, they have very fine detail about this thing, and 43 days have passed in the intervening period, and I'm kind of scratching my head as to why Sky haven't gone back to the UCI or haven't been able to publicly say, here's this, like, what are they going to find after that duration of time has passed that can exonerate him here?
Well, I mean, there will be urine stored, so and so they will ask for that stuff, and we'll, you know, and then they will send it to a lab and see what they can find, essentially.
Morning, Sean. Just, you said yourself there you've been up against it when it comes to Sky fans. I presume that's via Twitter quite a lot this week, but you look at the catalogue of Sky demeanours at this point, you look at the Sergio Henao incident, you look at Bradley Wiggins, you look at Kennecourt, you look at the Jiffy Bag, and now you look at salbutamol. There is a huge body of evidence to suggest now, well, not just to suggest, but to tell us that the Team Sky, this whole kind of non-tolerance for any sort of connection with doping is complete nonsense. Why, like, what is with the Team Sky fans that they actually can't see this? Or do you feel that there is actually a certain body of fans who are like, right, fair enough, Team Sky aren't what they all kind of build themselves as to be?
I mean, I've written this before, but I think for many British sports fans, you know, success remains a powerful amnesiac. They, you know, that seems to, you know, dominate everything. I think certainly we can say with definite say Team Sky have lost the kind of benefit of the doubt now, and it's not just the stuff you mentioned; it's the whole Jiffy Bag delivered to Bradley Wiggins in the Criterion de Dauphiné. You've got to remember, so they wrongly claimed that the British cycling courier Simon Cope had not travelled to France to deliver the package to Wiggins, but to see Emma Pooley. That was wrong. He denied that Wiggins and Dr. Richard Freeman were on the team bus together at Dauphiné. The video evidence proved they were. You know, all of stuff. So I don't know, but that's. I don't think Brits are unique to this. You know, every country supports its own, even when perhaps, you know, there are questions to be asked.
During the summer, I was chatting to John Robertson, who was like one of the first professional trainers for Chris Froome, and he agreed with the point at that time that Froome should consider removing himself from the situation because there was so much bad press about Dave Brailsford and about Team Sky. Those goalposts have well and truly shifted at this point, haven't they? That Froome, the Froome supporters will say anyway, have been dragged down to that level about the entire grey area that was shrouding Team Sky ahead of the Tour this summer. Absolutely.
I mean, it's not just Wiggins. It's not just Froome. I think we have to be honest with ourselves here. That there's a lot of grey areas in cycling. We don't know how much of it goes into the black. Perhaps, you know, I was chatting to one cycling journalist from the old days who kind of said to me recently, well, compared to how things are now with people taking triamcinolone and perhaps other corticosteroids or doing other stuff in competition, it's a hell of a lot better than it was 20 years ago when almost everyone was doing EPO. That may be true, but these are still, you know, violations we're talking about. There's still things that they shouldn't be doing, or certainly straying into the, you know, the greys in many cases. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out in the wash.
Just lastly, on this point for me, Sean, like, obviously there was brilliant work gone into getting this story because we needed this first step in terms of the whole Chris Froome persona. But at the same time, you mustn't have been overly surprised when you get this sort of thing, because you look at Chris Froome and you look at his career and you look at the unbelievable average nature of how he was in his early professional days, that there was always going to be suspicions around him. And do you feel that this potentially could be the start of something more, or is the salbutamol going to be the end of the Chris Froome story?
I mean, the honest answer is, you know, I don't know. You know, Froome is entitled to due process. We see where that ends. I mean, what I would say, though, I think anyone that comes to journalists, the whistleblowers, those that are brave enough to speak out, you know, look at what's happened this year. You know, look at how do we find out about the whole Russian doping? It was because a guy fled Russia with lots of data and was able to, you know, no one would have believed it. It would have been too fantastical to hear. You know, we need good people when they know there's stuff that they think is a little bit suspicious, or even while they need to come. Obviously, I'm a journalist, I'm going to want this, but I think for the wider good, you know, there needs to be there are people out there that know what's going on, and they need to come to us and tell us.
Yeah, and I think that Chris Froome's reaction to it as well has really not helped things in terms of people who might believe that Chris Froome is in fact innocent of any wrongdoing here, that it's been Sean Spicer levels of distraction from the case at hand, this stuff about stigma of inhaler use and asthma use and bizarre enough commentary. We'll hope to speak to you on that again, Sean. We mentioned a bit earlier that we'd been on to you earlier in the week too, because you'd written a brilliant piece about Phil Taylor in the context of the darts ongoing at the minute. That was the initial rationale for having you on. We do want to get a quick word with you on that as well. It was a very good piece in The Guardian that I highly recommend that people go and check out. Having read the piece, the main takeaway that I kind of took about Phil Taylor was that he's a winner but not a champion. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, I think that's true. He's, you can't really knock his record. He's the 16 world titles, the length of his career. I mean, as I wrote in the piece, when he won his first world title in 1990, Sir Alex Ferguson was on the brink of the sack at Manchester United. Margaret Thatcher was still in power in Britain. I mean, it's an incredible effort to sustain it for so long, all that travelling, all that practice, and so on. At the same time, not many people, there's not much love there. There might be a lot of respect, but he can be a bit of an arse.
Yeah, to say the least, like a really difficult guy to warm to, even if you don't know the backstory, most of which you've painted here about, the relationship with his fellow players, despite all the career earnings that he's had, the emergence, I think it was last year, maybe this year, that two of his daughters had been on benefits and some years ago indecently assaulting two 23-year-old women. I mean, there are very real, tangible reasons to dislike Phil Taylor.
Yeah, and I think some of it, though, I agree with all that, but some of it is a sort of a strange craving for respect. So here's a guy that recognised as the greatest player in the world ever, and he's 57. He can't have done much more, and yet recently, a guy called Darryl Gurney, who's one of the sport's rising stars, they get to the stage, Gurney pours himself some water, perhaps forgets to pour Taylor some water, and Taylor afterwards says the worst thing he did was he went out on stage and poured himself a drink of water and left me out. I thought, you disrespectful little shit, I'll get you for that. I mean, really, who thinks that? And if you do think it, who says it? I mean, it's very curious. He's
also been comparing himself this week to, Tiger Woods and these various other significant sports stars over the last 10 or 20 years, and saying that his achievements are better than all of those combined. There's just an arrogance here that doesn't really sort of wash that well with an audience, and I'm sure we'll see how that plays out over the last while. But I mean, you've mentioned some of the figures in your piece that when he initially started to compete in darts, that the prize winners pot, I think, was about 16k or thereabouts, and it's up to 400,000. I mean, he has utterly, coincidence or not with the fact that obviously the Sky money has come into it, he has utterly changed the sport.
Absolutely. I mean, I think he has taken darts into a second golden age. I mean, those of us that grew up in the 80s will remember the Eric Bristows, the Jockey Wilsons and so on. But really, by the early 90s, darts was fading. There was a great dart schism. I mean, if ever there was two bald men fighting over a comb, it was the BDO and the WDC at the time. But through the force of his, he was so much better than everyone else. He's managed to kind of make darts, semi-cool or very cool again. I mean, there's going to be thousands coming through the Ali Pali. It's got sponsorship, and that is down to him, because there was a long period from, I guess, the mid 90s to the mid 2000s where it was him and almost no one else that was any good in the PDC. But because he was whacking in these massive averages, people would watch him, and he's done a lot for the sport.
And is this it now? So Phil Taylor leaves the sport, and I actually don't find the Tiger Woods comparisons that ridiculous because of what he's done for the sport and how transcendent he's been for darts. So once he leaves the sport, are we going to see a downward curve in the popularity of the game?
I don't know. I think you've got a new bunch of rising stars. Michael Van Gerwen, hasn't yet obviously got the world titles that Phil Taylor has, but he's hit bigger three-dart averages at the World Championships than Taylor now. So I think there is a new generation that have come through. And if 5 years ago, you might have said, actually, yes, the darts will fall without Taylor. But he's going to carry on doing exhibitions. He owns he owns a chunk of the PDC anyway. He's bought into it. So whatever happens, the money will still be coming in for him. So he won't go poor.
Yeah, the Tiger Woods comparisons are probably fair enough. It's probably just not for him to make them, I guess, is kind of the point. Sean, it's been a pleasure speaking with you this morning. Keep up the good work. Thanks for joining us. Hey, hope you enjoyed that latest offering from Off the Ball. If you want to subscribe, and you should, check out just up here. All our latest stuff is just down here. Generally, knock yourself out.